Hello, I'm Rachel Chiza, host of the Meet Your Author podcast, where we celebrate African authors and have bookish conversations. Joining me today is Wanjiru Koinange, author of The Havoc of Choice from Kenya. How did I get to read The Havoc of Choice? A friend gifted it to me last year, and because I'd been seeing it on Instagram, I was dying to read it. And that was my first read this year, so I was so excited.
Yay.
Yes, it was. And when I was thinking about authors to host, I was like, of course. I have to host Wanjiru. I love the story. And yeah, let's not even get into it. Let's just, tell me who you are. I always find that question too difficult to answer, but hopefully you can tell us who you are.
Yeah, me too. I also struggle with that question. Who is Wanjiru? I am a Kenyan. I'm of Kikuyu descent. I am a writer and a restorer of public libraries. I come from a large family of 5 siblings. I'm the last born, and we're incredibly close. I spent some time with them last night, way too much time with them last night. So I'm suffering for it now. And I'm somebody who has always been kind of like a fly on the wall, observing. I love to people watch. I like to see humans be humans. I think it's why I'm a writer, because I often think that the biggest gift about being a writer is that you need to make so little up. So much is like out in the world. People are just busy being people, and that is often like more than you could bargain for.
Yeah.
So I've always been a bit of a quiet people. I'm definitely an introvert, but I really enjoy being in a corner watching. And I'm a person who's really driven by social change. I want everything that I do to change the status quo for the better, or to move the needle towards a change of the status quo for the better. So the work that I do outside of my writing it really examines and explores and experiments with how art and artistic creativity can be used as a catalyst for transformative and long-lasting social change.
I love that. And I read a bit about the book bank, but maybe we could talk just a little bit about what the book bank does.
Sure. So the book bank is an organization that I started along with my co-founder in 2017, and it was started because after I finished writing my first book inside a library, I wrote 70% of that book inside a library, or rather researched most 70% of it inside a library. And when I came back to Nairobi after my master's program, I realized that there were just not enough spaces, like the ones I'd spent the last 3 or 4 years in my city. And I basically just refuse to live in a city that doesn't have libraries that are thriving. And I don't want to wait for someone else to do the work. So I was very lucky to find somebody who shared my views. And together we have created this organization that is fully committed to adopting and transforming public libraries. In the beginning, we thought it was just about kind of getting in and doing a massive renovation and putting in some new books and leaving. But 5 years down the line, almost 6 now, we're learning that building truly inclusive palaces for the people, which is what we call our libraries, takes years of work. And years of culture shifting and years of experimenting. And that's the spot we're in now.
Yeah.
We're currently responsible for Nairobi's oldest library, which is the Macmillan Memorial Library. We are yet to restore that one, currently fundraising to restore that one. But we've currently finished 2 others that are about 15 minutes east of the city center. And those are my most favorite spaces in the entire country.
Oh, wow. That's amazing work. I can't even imagine the culture shifting that is going on, because even in Uganda, I don't think people really use libraries much. Yeah, so I can imagine the culture shift that would need to also go through if someone came up with your idea and to do it in Uganda. I could talk about the book bank, but let's talk about the book.
Yes. Today I'm not a CEO. Today I'm here as a writer.
Yeah. The Havoc of Choice. What is the book about? And yeah, let's start from there, and then we'll go into why you wrote the story.
Okay. The Havoc of Choice is a story about family first. It's a story about a family going through what is Kenya's most painful and most violent elections since independence. It follows the daughter of a political leader, a former political leader. Her name is Kavata, and her family. She falls in love with with her husband Gugi when they're in university, and throughout the relationship, Gugi begins to get a sense of what Kavata's life was like when she was living under the shadow of her father.
Yeah.
So, and also all of the PTSD and all of the trauma that came with being the daughter of a 1990 politician who was known for his corruption and known for his less than ethical judgments.
Yeah.
So the last thing Kavata wants from anyone is to be involved in politics, because that's been her life. And then her husband goes around and runs for office, and she's like, what the hell? We had this conversation. And his decision to run for office triggers a whole other set of decisions that scatter the family into different parts of the country in the weeks leading up to the 2007 election. And when this happens, and the election happens, and the violence that we all know happens, Kavata's family and the people that sacrifice their lives to make her family comfortable are all over the country. Because what we do in Kenya, I've never really understood, because you vote where you live and where you want to see change, but because we still vote along tribal lines here, so you want to go and vote for your guy in tribes to get into office, and something that I think we need to examine a bit more. And that's what the family does when the 7 election comes, and when the violence breaks out all over the country. And through the experiences, you can get a sense of what really happened in Kenya in this moment that I don't think we've spoken enough about.
Yeah, I totally agree. When I read the novel, it made me get back to all my Kenyan friends and ask, where were you guys when this happened? Were you in Nairobi? Were you in Shags? Where were you exactly? And I agree that we haven't seen much of that. 2007, I think I was still in high school. So I remember hearing about it, but I had not read extensively. So the book gave me an idea of what happened. And I was so sad. I went down the rabbit hole. I was Googling everything, reading. And I wonder why it was so important for you to tell this story the way that you did. You know, you could have written an essay, a long research and all that. Why fictionalize it?
Because fun fact, this book was supposed to be nonfiction when I started it, because I hadn't really seen trauma captured in fiction in the way that I wanted to. So when I wrote early drafts of it, I named the people I was naming. Because if you're in Kenya and you read the book, you know exactly who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
But and I think at the point I was a lot more, I don't want to say brave or stupid or one of those two that I am now, because I hadn't really thought about the repercussions of saying these things as a young writer who wants to have a long career. And publishing. So the reason why, but even when it was nonfiction, it was always going to be this creative nonfiction where you have fictional stories telling you you have fictional characters telling you a nonfiction story. So it was really experimental at its core. I didn't succeed in that format because I wasn't experienced a writer then, and I'm gonna grow into that kind of writer. But I made it fictional, and I made it about family because I wanted to trick people into caring about what happened in 2007. If I called this the Havoc of Elections in Kenya, the book would be I just know my people. I know readers. If I called it How to Not Kill People, like if I called it what it was, I don't think it would resonate the way that it does. And I know that the one thing that holds us common as Kenyans, as people, that we care about family, we care about our children, we care about where we're from, we care about our homes. And I made a story about family because I wanted the political parts of the story had been widely covered, both in nonfiction and fiction. But nobody had really, at that stage when I was writing this book, I hadn't seen anybody who had really drilled down to what this did to our cycle as Kenyans, what this did to the way that we grieve, what this did to the way that we now hold elections. And the only way to do that is to go to the personal. And family means everything to me. I told you I come from a big family, we're very close. And even for our family, we were distanced from it because we weren't really affected. But the people who, as I mentioned, make our lives easier, my father's driver was really affected by that violence. Well, my biggest inconvenience was that I couldn't go to the liquor store. My experience very much mirrored what Maja was going through, where your biggest inconvenience is everything is closed. I can't go see my friends. It's New Year's Eve. But later, when I look back and saw the scale of the damage and that loss, I'm like, and I couldn't buy booze. That was my inconvenience. How is that possible in a country that's so connected? But how could we be so disconnected at the same time? Totally.
Family like I really cared about Kavata and Ngugi. I was in there with them. I was in there with their children when they lost their son. I was so sad.
Yeah.
It's like beautiful storytelling. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank
And I'm
you.
glad that it wasn't
Thank you.
nonfiction.
Because you probably would have read it, right?
No, I really like nonfiction. I do.
Okay.
But I'm
Okay.
glad that it was fictionalized because then we have more people reading it who would never read
Yeah.
nonfiction. And
Yeah.
it's easy to
True.
digest. It's easy to digest as you go on it, and very informative. For me, it was highly informative about the election and going and seeing that you're able to get history and just disseminate it for us who would never read all the reporters, the reports that have been put out there by different reporters. I mean, you did the hard work for us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was my honor and my pleasure.
Okay. How did you, and I think this adds up to the previous question, how did you consolidate that difficult history into just a few pages? I don't know. I always find it difficult how writers get to do that, how you get difficult, like how they write about the genocide in a few pages. How do people do that? How do you choose what to take out and what to keep? And what do you do with all the other research?
That's a question of my life. And that was probably the hardest bit of the book. And that happens again in the editing, which is why I've learned for a book like this, it's really not about the writing, it's about the care you're taking the editing process. That's where the storytelling happens. I think I liken this book to making a documentary. When you're making a documentary, you kind of shoot everything and you shoot everything until you have no more money to shoot or until you've hit a wall. And then you're like, okay, this is what we have. Let's piece together what the story is here. And I think that was what the case was for this book, because I already knew what the story was.
Mm-hmm.
I already know what happened in 07. I knew I did a ton of research, and research is my backbone. I'm a journalist by training.
Mm-hmm.
So I am comfortable with facts. I find comfort in data and in trends and in facts. So I started with several months, almost 9 months of research, reading everything, remembering everything, scouring the internet at the time because I was away from home, asking friends to send me books to South Africa so I can read them, and also just appreciating the distance I had not living in Nairobi, being from Kenya, not living there in a time when I had to really examine my country. The distance really helped. And then I wrote this book as part of my master's thesis at the University of Cape Town. And I don't necessarily think that master's was very useful, but I don't think it made me a better writer. I think editing the book over 8 years made me a better writer. But what the master's did is give dedicated time and give me a nugget of wisdom from my supervisor at the very early days of my course. He told me, you start a story as close to the end as possible. That way you can spend your time telling it, you can focus on the important things, you can rush when you need to rush. And you see, with the election, I'm like, do I start at Independence? At the beginning of that year, or do I start at the beginning of when does this story start?
Yeah.
And I pick a week. The story happens in a span of a week, and I pick that week because I'm like, there's so much happening, and there's so much I need to explain. In fact, my publishers would have preferred my book was much smaller. I really had to cut at least. It was maybe another 150 pages longer than it is now, because we really had to dive into every single chapter and be like, is this backstory useful, or does it confuse the readers about who this person is? Mm-hmm. When you say this, do you mean this or do you mean that? And I had to do this on so many levels because my book was initially picked up by a UK publisher, mm-hmm. who and I'm represented by an Indian agent. Yeah. So I had all of these voices giving me notes about my book, but none of them were Kenyan. And I'm like, you guys are good writers and good agents and good editors, but you're not Kenyans. Yeah. And you haven't met me. And I don't want to be dragged because I forgot I overlooked something really, really big. So months before the book came out, I panicked and I just put together my own resources and hired an editor in Kenya who was as far different from me as possible. Like, I hired a man, he was older than me, from a different tribe, as different as I could get from who I was, and I asked him to read the book, and I'm just like, to rip it apart. Like, don't spare my feelings. Like, this is a paid investment. You're doing a job and do it well. And that, for me, is one of the reasons why I think the book is so accurate emotionally and historically and factually, because it was tested against all of these different kind of litmus strips to make sure that it resonates and it's true and it's factual. Because with history, it's tricky. You have to you have to be sure that you're telling the truth.
Yes.
And for this book, it took me 8 years to be sure that everything I was saying is
Wow.
either the truth or an opinion that I'm willing to defend. It had to be one of those two things
Yeah.
to stay in the book. Yeah.
At what point did you bring in the Kenyan editor? Because I know with the publishing industry, especially abroad, is that as much as they would like to publish African writers, they have limits as to what should appear in the books, because really Africa is not considered an audience per se. We don't really buy that many books. So they are creating bodies of work for their audience in abroad. And I wonder, at what point did you bring in the Kenyan writer to help them, for them to, to have a look at your work, and then when you got it back to the editor, what did your editor abroad, what did they think?
So that's a great question, because it's also connected to the publishing deals. You can see behind me, like these two covers. So this was the original cover from the UK, and that was the first book deal. And everything about the book deal just wasn't what I expected. If the number wasn't right, the speed of things wasn't right, the cover that was put, it didn't feel like I was a part of the process. And that's when I began to panic, because it had been maybe a year after I'd signed the contract, and I was watching these things. And you spend so much time with this thing. It's your child. Your first book is your baby. And I felt like my baby wasn't being cared for in the right way. And then I had all of these anxieties around, but Kenyans, I'm writing this book for Kenyans, but the UK market is great, but it's not my primary audience. My primary audience is Kenyans.
Yeah.
And then I was also just beginning to do my own research around self-publishing and what that looks like, and what have I sacrificed by giving the UK publisher my worldwide exclusive right. And I discovered what I'd given them. I'm like, hold up. Let's back. I want to renegotiate. And thankfully, they dropped the ball in so many ways that I had a really strong footing, and I had a good team. I had an IP lawyer. My good friend is an IP lawyer, and I had an agent who knew the market and who knew that even if this was the best publisher for me at the time, they weren't giving the book the best. So because of this, I was able to get back my Africa right. I'm like, you can publish in the UK. I want Africa, and I put an expiry date on my UK publishing deal. And that gave me the chance to then come back home. And at this stage, Book Bank was and my co-founder is a publisher. We were just trying to figure out like what our other thing will do. Like, libraries are great, but we need to build a machine to put the books into this library. So we really wanted to build a publishing house. And I had a manuscript that was ready to go. And I'm like, let's test out our publishing house with this manuscript. And that's how this edition came to be. And this edition, I had I set up the business, got the investors, I set up every single thing. This edition taught me about the publishing industry. And that's why it's kind of like my favorite. Even the cover was my sister who did that. I really touched every single bit of this edition. I'm grateful for this one, because it showed me what I wanted. But this is the one that kind of warmed my heart. And so when we were doing this edition is when I brought in the Kenyan lens. I got the Kenyan readers. I got a Kenyan designer to think about the cover, and that delayed things significantly. But I didn't care. I'm like, it's been 8 years. You're gonna wait another year. At that point, it had been 7 years. I'm like, you're gonna wait, because at this stage it has to be perfect. I'm
so glad you got your Africa rights back.
Thank you. It's the biggest nugget. I'm like, any African writers listening to this, please don't give away your worldwide rights. Don't give anyone access to your work in a region they have no business. If you're European publisher, stick to Europe, because they're gonna take everything. You don't know better, and they want everything because it means that they can make more revenue sending your books across the world. But even to date, there's still regions that I'm still pursuing publishers for this book. I don't have a South African publisher. I don't have a West African publisher. I don't have a European publisher. But breaking it up and taking it back means that I can choose where my book gets visibility first, and I can choose markets that aren't necessarily looked at. I'm publishing the UAE. I don't know how many African writers can say that, but I'm like, I want to be in Arabic, because Arabic is spoken more widely than it is. So I'm like, I want to be in Arabic as well.
What was your writing practice like in the 8 years that you're writing this book? Would you wake up, you know how they say wake up every morning and write 1,000 words or 100 words? And then the next day you say more before you go to bed. Was that your practice, or would you write and then come back a month later?
It was different at different stages, depending on what my life was doing. So for the first section, for the first maybe, I want to say 2 years, I was exclusively a student. And a student hustling on the side, living that international student life at UCT. So then I had a room in the English department in UCT that was dedicated to me. And every day I would lock myself in there and I would write. And that made me finish the first draft in about 9 months. And so it was 9 months of research, or let's call it a year, about a year of research and a year of writing after that. And then it was my job. I would go in at 9, I would leave at 3, I would go for a run at 3, and come back and do a 2 hours of that. But then I got the book out quickly. And that, I think, actually is some of like when I think about my life in the past, I'm like, oh, I could go back to those days when all I was doing was just like getting paid to write, while getting paid by means of getting a scholarship. And then when I came back home and had to do other work, and I was trying to figure out what my impact would be and what my other non-writerly work would be, then I was doing the 5 a.m. thing when I'd wake up at 5 and spend my first 3 hours on the manuscript. And then it was mostly revision.
Yeah.
And then I'd do my other things throughout the day. Whenever the chance came, I would go away and rent a cabin somewhere in nature and for like a week or two and exclusively write. And that's kind of how my writing life has continued now that I'm spending 90% of my time on book bank. I just don't have the luxury of the time to write as often as I'd like to. But what I do every year is I dedicate 3 months to writing, either at a chunk, so I just take time off and I take a sabbatical and I go and I write, or I take it in fragmented bits throughout the year, because I now know that I need to switch off one brain completely, shut the factory down, and then go into the basement and do the writing. And it's something that I'm really trying to cultivate, because I realize that my work life would stop. So I don't want it to, because those two things feed different parts of my soul. So I've got to find a way to do them both. And do them both all the time.
Finding the balance. The hardest thing about everything is finding the balance. It's so
completely. Yeah.
But I'm hopeful, because after you've read a debut writer, then you're looking forward to reading their next work. And I'm definitely, after reading your book, I was like, I hope Wanjiru is writing something else.
I am, very slowly, but I am. Yeah. Writing is fun. I'm always going to be writing something. Okay. You can rest assured. It's a thing. Everything that I'm doing is leading to a path where I can write exclusively. So I just need to find a way to have millions in the bank all the time. Working on it.
All right. And I know you mentioned a bit earlier that there were books that during your research process, there were books that you were reading. What books were those that helped you, I guess, get knowledge or some form of understanding to write The Havoc of Choice?
So I prefer not to read fiction when I'm writing, because it voices. Yeah. So when I'm writing and I'm actively, if I'm researching and stuff like that, that's fine. But when I'm actually typing, I don't like to read. And I remember this because, like, in the section of The Havoc of Choice that's really descriptive in the beginning, I really go into like details of things. It's because I was reading Shantaram by Gregory, what's his last name? But you know that book, Shantaram is the most descriptive book in the world. And I remember at some point I'd read it at night, and I go home and I'm spending hours and pages describing a tissue box, and I'm like, this guy's voice is sliding in. So that's when I stopped. If I'm actively writing, I watch a lot of film, and I'll read poetry if I have to read something. But during the research phase, I read everything I could find about post-election violence. And at the time, there was a lot, but it was a lot of reportage. It was a lot of critical analysis and reports around like the reconciliation commissions, a lot of YouTube footage of the elections. The election season, the campaign, the news, and everything. I read there wasn't a lot of fiction. It was too soon for fiction, and even now, I think sometimes there's a lot more fiction now about the violence than there was at the time. But what I remember is just a lot of media coverage, a lot of outsiders going in and doing op-eds and all of that. So those were my sources for the research. During the writing, I just watched as much film as I could, and film that was about the thing I was writing about, film about conflict, about war. I was teaching at UCT at the time. I was teaching first year English, and we had to teach Half of a Yellow Sun. That book was the backbone of my writing. Yeah. I'm sure it's very evident in the way that The Havoc of Choice turned out, because I was really, the one thing I love about the way Chimamanda wrote that book is just how she's able to give such softness and such tenderness to harrowing acts and like completely devastating moments, and something that still, it's probably one of my top 3 favorite books of all time because of that, because it really gave names and faces to a historical moment that until then had meant nothing to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you on that. I read Half of a Yellow Sun a few years ago, and to this day, I still think about the characters.
Yeah.
Wonder why Kainene just disappeared. Like, can she come back?
Yes. I'm like,
She
where's
needs to
Kainene?
come
Babe?
back.
Come back.
So yeah, because I had also not read about the Biafra War, and that book gave me that, just like your book, The Havoc of Choice, with the 2007 elections, really giving us faces and names to such a gruesome act. I mean, even like I had to call my friends and ask one of them, were you in Nairobi? Like, were you guys harmed? Are you okay? I just like I couldn't believe it. And I mean, us being next door neighbors, this could happen in Uganda. It could happen to any country, right? So it was for me, it brought it home. And every time I think about the story, I'm just shaken that something like that happened. And I like that you gave us indeed a family setting, and it wasn't just wide and out there, but these were people that we knew. So I really, really like that about the book. And so, what are you currently listening to? Either podcast or, I don't know, a song or interviews?
But before I answer this question, something that you said that I want to just respond to about how this could happen and how it can happen again. And that is something that I really want to highlight. Sorry, I'm on a cast. Like, can we cast on this podcast? But this shit can happen again if we don't really examine the history of how we do elections, and not just in Kenya. I think it's a regional problem. I dare say it's a continental problem. We really have to look at this thing that we're calling democracy and choice and the elections and how we do them, and if they're really serving their purpose. So I think we inherited something and we haven't examined it, and because of that, we're so quick to move on when trauma happens. We're not okay. I know in Uganda when you guys have elections, it's such a tense moment. It's the same way it is here at home.
Yeah.
But we should be joyful to be voting. It's a moment where we get to choose our leadership. It should be some of the most important, but it's not for me, and it's not for many Kenyans, it's not for many Africans, and that's problematic. We've got to talk about that.
Yeah.
And that's what I hope that the book begins to do in its own small way, in its own small circle, and in very many big ways. I want the book to ask or inspire people to ask the right questions about how we're doing things.
Yeah, I think you achieved that. Yeah. What are you listening to?
Currently preparing for Beyoncé concert. I'm listening to lots of Beyoncé. I'm going to see her in June. So she's on rotation at the moment on my playlist. I'm also listening to a podcast called the Resetter Podcast, which is about resetting your life for women to reset their lives to the moon cycle, and not so much the very masculine patriarchal cycle of every week is the same, and every week you don't never miss a Monday, and if you miss a Monday, the world is over, and all of these things that we keep saying and shaping our lives to, while we know as women that, like, for instance, a week before your cycle, everything is all over the place, and you shouldn't be doing more than you want to. And I'm really trying to learn how to reset my life to my body's internal cycle.
Yeah,
it's called the Resetter Podcast, and I recommend it. I'm also watching as much East African television as I can, because I want to play with film in the future, and writing for film, making, I don't know, something about film is calling my name recently. So I'm really seeing what creativity is coming out of this region, and I'm really enjoying that, because film has always been, I think it remains one of the biggest influencers of my storytelling. Books, I'm a reader, but I don't read as much books as I do watch films, and I also I'm really in awe about the brevity of film. Film is short, it's long, but it's short.
Yeah.
And just how you have 90 minutes to capture people and tell them a story. With books, I have days and weeks and months, but I'm always intrigued by like a really good, well told, compact story. So I'm watching anything East African. Any recommendations are welcome at the moment.
I will think about Ugandan films and share a list and see if you like anything. Yeah, I know there's some who are really doing amazing things, so I'll share the list.
Okay.
All right. And the last question for today is, what tips would you give to writers who want to write what would call historical facts?
I do. One would be research, research, research. There's no such thing as too much research. Give yourself a deadline, extend the research deadline, and when you're ready to put the research down and start writing, write. But do your research. You're writing about history. It's sensitive. It's delicate. You don't want to offend people because you were lazy.
Yeah.
So if you're gonna do the historical thing, you just have to commit to spending as much time researching as you do writing the work. The second thing is with historical writing, and my book is historical, if you can call 13 years ago history, but I'm like history is yesterday and history is 100 years ago, right? But you have to, there's so many angles, and it's always a big thing, right? Like I can't imagine writing about Kony and the impact it's had, or not just Uganda, but like the region, and even just like the way that warfare happens now. You have to find the small angle that only you can tell, the angle that excites you, the angle that you're the most curious about, the angle that you're willing to spend years and years and years investigating, because if you get bored, your readers will get bored. For me, that angle was the family and the political family specifically, because my family, my father was a son of a politician. My father was never in politics, but his father was. So there's a story that I know of who my grandfather was via my father and my uncles and my family members, and also there's a public version of who my grandfather was. And I've always grappled with those versions. And you see, that's a grappling that only I can describe in my language. So when I talk about Kavasa, I know what it must feel like from watching my father be. So you have to find the thing that's personal to you. And even if it's too close to home, that's probably it, because no one knows that thing more than you do. No one knows what it's like to, if you are Kony's, God forbid, if you are a relative of Kony, no one knows what that's like more than you do. So you have to find the angle that's yours and yours alone. Because if you can't fake it, we will know if you're faking it. Your readers are intelligent. So you've really got to find your niche and run with it, because history is big and it's intimidating.
And very delicate. Those are wonderful tips. Really, you can't be lazy when it comes to history and such delicate history.
No, you can't. And write other things if you want to be. And there's genres you can be. And I'm gonna write romance because I can be frivolous with the romance, and I can lean into my emotions and my daring nature a bit more. But with history, you're dealing with people's realities in their lives, and you don't want to be careless with that.
You have to be really careful. All right. Oh my goodness, we could go on and on. I've really loved talking to you, and I will hopefully be back in the future to talk about publishing, because that's something that we need to talk about in Africa. Publishing in East Africa and Africa-wide, we really need to talk about that. But I don't know. I think one last thing: are you open to publishing in Uganda, or there's no need? You just need to have a supplier.
So I would love a publisher in Uganda. We just need to figure out the pros and cons, because currently my distribution deal with Textbook Center is that they service the entire region, so they should be able to distribute to Uganda easily. But I mean, if it means that my book can reach further because it's been published in Uganda, I will not get in the way of that. My publishing contract with Bank Books is almost done, and it can always be amended to remove a territory if that comes into if that's needed. But we're also in a very tricky space with the publishing house. Unfortunately, it hasn't done as much as it can, because it's only the two of us, and there's only so much we can do. So we're having to maybe make the difficult decision to put that on ice until we can until we've focused or finished the Macmillan restoration, and we can now turn our attention to this child and give it you. Otherwise, we're half-assing it, and that's just not the way I like to do things.
I get that. And at least we are neighbors, and we can still access the book. That's
indeed
good.
And let me know if there's places that need the book and don't have it. I'm happy to make connections with our distributors and get it circulated.
I will let you know. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Rachel.
All right, bye.
It was my pleasure. Bye.
Thank you for joining us today. Subscribe to the podcast and enjoy a bookish ride.